A very good afternoon to all the ladies and the gentlemen present here. I feel what a wonderful way to start this leisurely, breezy Sunday afternoon. And I welcome you all to yet another mesmerizing session at the Vasant Vihar Literature Festival. आज की इस अलसाई सी मखमली सी दोपहर में हम बात करेंगे आंचल मल्होत्रा की नई पेशकश द बुक ऑफ एवरलास्टिंग थिंग्स के बारे में. We are very pleased and honored to have Aanchal with us here today, and leading the discussion with her, we have the very distinguished and dynamic Miss Mala Shri Lal. May I request the two of you to please take your seats on the dais? Words actually do not do justice to their achievements, but we shall still try to thread it all together. Aanchal is a writer and oral historian from New Delhi. She is the co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory and the author of two critically acclaimed books, Remnants of a Separation and In the Language of Remembering, that together explore the human history and generational impact of the 1947 partition. Her work has won the Council for Museum Anthropology Book Award and has been shortlisted for the British Academy Book Prize, the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar, Hindu Lit for Life Non-Fiction Prize, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay NIF Book Prize, and the Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize. Her newest book, on which we'd be talking today, is her debut novel titled The Book of Everlasting Things. Welcome, Aanchal. Miss Mala Shri Lal. Mala Shri Lal is a professor in the English department and former dean of the University of Delhi. She has to her credit 16 books, including In Search of Sita, Tagore and the Feminine, Finding and also Finding Radha. Her specialization is in literature, women and gender studies. Her poems and stories have been published in Indian Literature, Confluence, The Beacon, online portals and anthologies. She was a senior consultant to the Ministry of Culture and has served on the International Book Award juries. Madam Lal is a frequent speaker at literary festivals and is a member of the General Council of the Sahitya Akademi. Among other recognitions, Mala Shri Lal recently received the Maharani Gayatri Devi Award for Women's Excellence. Very pleased to have both of you here, ma'am. So just to give a brief background, तेरी यादों की खुशबू से हम महकते रहते हैं. तेरी यादों की खुशबू से हम महकते रहते हैं. जब जब तुझको सोचते हैं, बहकते रहते हैं. कुछ ऐसी ही रूहानियत और रुमानियत होती है हमारी यादों में. पहला इकरार, पहला इनकार, पहली नज़र, सब खूबसूरत यादों में कैद हो जाता है. And it is this very emotion that Aanchal talks about in her book. It is the Lahore of 1938, when drawn by an intoxicating smell, Samir locks eyes with Firdaus through the rows of perfume bottles in his Itra shop. Over the years that follow, the love story of the perfumer and Firdaus takes unexpected turns, just like their lives. The premise itself leaves us yearning for more, which is why I now request our panelists to take this discussion forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a great pleasure to meet Aanchal Malhotra and to be here at the Vasant Vihar Literature Festival and this very select and wonderful audience that we have in front of us to discuss this book. So, as was just said, that it's a book that leaves you yearning for more when you hear the synopsis that was just given to us. Is it a love story? Is it a partition story? Is it a story about two people and their families across generations? Is it about travel? It's all of this and more. And Aanchal, I must say that once I started reading the first page of this wonderful book, although it's a massive book, I couldn't put it down. I just kept turning the pages and wanting to know more and more as to what happened to Samir and to Firdaus. And it was something that just kept me moving because it's an intricate and complex weaving of history and fiction that you have done. So my sort of summarizing thoughts about it, and it's a very personal reaction to the book, that it is a remarkable story about how you've used the idea of the senses to talk about the characters. There is this person, Samir, who is into perfumery. So there you get the sense of smell, and that's very, very delicate, very intricate, and something that has to be honed over time to become a good perfumer. And then there is Firdaus, who's a calligrapher, and that's where you use the sense of skin, touch, the pen, the paper, the colors that are made from petals probably. So this whole business about using sight, smell, and then memory. So much of the novel is about memory. But memory comes from hearing people, from remembering it. So there again, there is the sight and the sound of dialogues that stay with you over time. But these are my individual thoughts about the book. Be happy to hear what your motivational idea was for this book and how you perceive this and what is the primary theme according to you, the author.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for sacrificing your Sunday afternoon to listen to me. What kind of book is this? It's complicated for me to answer that in a single direct way because I am a historian who has just become a novelist. I always have the background of history in my mind even when I'm writing fiction. And if you would ask me what the theme, the larger theme of this book is, I would probably say something like it is a family story to talk about the passage of memory from one generation to another and how the actions and memory of our ancestors very much determine our present and our future, and how much or little of that we want in our lives is the negotiation. You mentioned that it is a book about the senses. It very much is. And the reason for that is that before I was a writer, I was a printer. I trained to be a metal engraver. And for years, for nearly a decade in fact, I worked in a printmaking studio with my hands. I worked on copper, zinc, limestone, wood, screen printing, paper making, book making, calligraphy, letterpress, which is why there is a desire to insert the tactile and visceral body into the book. I think when your way of negotiating the world is through images, even when you become a writer, you want to be a visual writer. So that's where the tactility of the art form of calligraphy at least comes from. Where did perfumery come from? I would say like the major protagonist in my novel, Samir, is a perfumer. He is born into a family of perfumers and he lives in Lahore, a Lahore that is still not partitioned. And several years ago, my mother told me a story about her father, who is a chemist. He used to be a chemist for Dabur, and he used to make soaps and shampoos and lotions and things like that. And he would receive these vials of different essences, you know, rose essence, papaya essence, aloe vera, jasmine. And he would use them in his creations, and whatever he wouldn't use, he would bring home and he would put into the water of the cooler in the summer. So when the cooler would go on at home, one day the house would smell of a rose, the other day it would smell of a papaya, the third day it would smell of, you know, jasmine mixed with geranium. And I think this very tender idea of one person going out of their way to make sure an entire family is cocooned in beautiful smells was something that really, it stuck with me. And I felt like I had never known my grandfather to do things like that. I'd always known him to be quite a stern person. So this very beautiful, loving act became the memory upon which the character of Vivek, the older perfumer in the book, is hinged. And I started thinking of a family that were every day involved in the making and propagation of scent. So they're not only like they're perfumers, but they're also harvesters of smell, they're distillers of smell. And I wanted to create this ambience where the entire family was cocooned in perfume. So came the twin arts of perfumery and calligraphy.
It's fascinating as to how you make the art of smell such an elegant and aesthetic subject in your novel. And thinking of perfume, I'm sure each of us wants to talk about Paris, think about Paris and France. And there is a lot of that in your novel. And it comes to us through the older person, Vivek, the person who is a soldier in the First World War in Europe. And again, Anchal, I must compliment you on bringing that element into the story. Because there are hardly any novels about the military history of the Indian soldiers who went to Europe to fight in the First World War, and the memoirs that they may have left behind, or even a storytelling about them. The only one I can remember is by Mulk Raj Anand, and that's not even supposed to be one of his best books. And more recently, Navteej Sarna in The Crimson Spring has a character who's been to the Great War. But you have brought this person, Vivek, into the story in a following manner. That here is the older generation, and as you said, that's very important to the storytelling. And this person enlists as a soldier, and then for a long time he just disappears. The family doesn't know where he is. And then one day he comes back. What had happened to him in that interim? What trauma, what memories, what experiences, what sensations, what emotions, none of that will he reveal. And that becomes, for me, a very important aspect of the novel, because it is the trauma of the military experience that nobody writes about. And yet you have dovetailed it with the romance story of the next generation. And then much later in the novel, and I won't reveal the story, of course, much later in the novel, the so-called truth about Vivek's experiences in Paris comes out. So how did you work out this intricate plotting of the novel of romance with the novel of military history?
I think it's only because I'm a historian that it could be so streamlined, because there are very complicated subplots to take care of in the book. There are lots of threads that go from page 1 to page 400 and whatever, you're carrying them throughout. There are lots of loose ends that need to be tied up. But I think the hardest thing about writing a novel of this scale and ambition is the fact that you're writing about someone's life from the day they are born to the day they die. So we forget sometimes, because we are living our lives, that our lives are actually made up of past, present, in conjunction. There are a lot of things about our everyday that are impacted by our ancestors' past, and so is the case with Samir. He has a romance with Firdaus, hardly romance, it starts as a kind of little friendship and blossoms into romance over a decade, but there is an understanding in his life that he has an uncle Vivek that went to the war, and this is a topic that is taboo in the house. Right? This is a topic that even despite his knowledge that his uncle goes to war, learns the art of perfumery somewhere in France and comes back a perfumer to Lahore alive from the war, is a topic that is never discussed in his family. And he absolutely takes for granted that this has happened, and he's not really interested in it either until his own life circumstances force him to face, I suppose, the origin of his nose. How has he inherited this sense of smell from a person who was once a soldier? The very simple, I suppose the simplest way to describe how this novel was written is a series of lists and notes. I'm a very organized writer. I also believe very much in writing longhand. So most of the novel was writing on in a notebook. But it consisted of dividing the story story is already divided between 5 parts. Further dividing those parts into the years, further dividing those years into sections of text, and then trying to see where the threads of one fit the threads of another. It sounds like a really mechanical way of writing, but in fact, when you are dealing with a story that I suppose, progresses over 5 generations and multiple geographies, you have to be very record conscious, because everyone has a present and everyone has a past, and they need to meet at some point with other people's present and past. And I think it was a good exercise in keeping the histories of many people, which I have done for a long time in my non-fiction anyway.
I can see the systematic note-keeping would have helped to stay with the correct chronology in the novel, very complex novel and 5 generations, and yet not make the reader conscious about the dating of every chapter, etc. It's very well done. I am, however, a little surprised when you say that it isn't so much the romance between Samir and Firdaus that the novel, because somehow I got the impression that this was absolutely beautiful, flowering romance among young people who'd met when they were only 10 and 9 years old. And the next 10 years, that emotion blossomed into beautiful young romance. One a calligrapher's apprentice, the other a perfumer's apprentice. And there's this young, but yes, they are from 2 different religions. And then the partition happened. And the families were separated. Especially when you have a novel that begins in Lahore, 1938, and carries on until very contemporary times with the young generation.
2017.
2017. Now, one can't avoid talking about the partition, and I don't want that to be considered the center of your novel, but nevertheless, it's partition that parted the young lovers. And these are young lovers who then continued to long for each other and not be able to connect with each other through the generations. And there are very intricate journals and letters and histories which are dovetailed into this complex structure. So in what way and to what extent is it a partition novel or is it not?
I would say partition is a large landscape of the novel. It is the reason why a love affair has a longer memory than the affair itself. Right? It is also the reason why so many people in real life parted in very similar ways. But there is not just a visceral partition of land. There is also partition of the mind, partition of friendships, partition of what homeland is. And I think at some point Samir himself says that when he's an older man, he says, I have spent more years thinking about the past than the years that the past actually happened. So partition becomes formative in the sense that it is shadow throughout the book. But if you are going into this novel thinking it is set around partition and that is the end all, then you're going to be disappointed. And I think this is a very important point to make about literature that revolves around partition, that not everything with partition happened in August 47. The shadow of partition is far longer stretching even to present day, impacting generations that have never been touched by its trauma. So in that sense, partition is ever present in the book. But it is also, as you said, a novel about love. It is a novel about friendship. It is a novel about war, a novel about senses. And I think in a lot of ways, a novel about reconciliation with the past you cannot change.
We often hear the phrase, the long partition, the shadow of the partition. What fascinated me about your book, Anchal, is that it's not the after shadow of the partition, but almost the casting ahead of the partition. Because your novel begins well before the partition actually happens. And if one were to go into an even earlier historical moment, the Jallianwala Bagh 1919, that also is a foreshadowing of the communal tensions, the role of the British administrators in fanning that communal tension, etc. So this long partition, and as you rightly say, that it's there somewhere in the context and very significant, but that's not the only focus of the book. I want to ask you next about the young generation, since you bring the novel right up to our time, 2017. And there are these 2 young people. There is Samir Khan, who's been named for Samir Vij. How did that come about? And there is the progeny of Firdausa's family. And there is Anouk. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name correctly. So what are your thoughts on the portrayal of the young generation, and what role do they play in the management of historical memory?
There are two young people in the book that I think are around the same age that I am, in the mid-30s. And they are the people that in some way close the circle because they discover their grandparents' secret. It is not so much a discovery as it is a barrage of questions. Because once you learn what has happened to an ancestor in the past, you can't unlearn it. You have to know more, and you start to ask, if you are even the least bit curious, you start to want to understand their origin, because somewhere down the course of their story begins your story. And so Samir Khan, who is Firdaus's grandson, named after the man she fell in love with, Samir, and Anouk, who is the original Samir's granddaughter, discover that before their respective grandparents had other lives and were married to people, they were in love with someone across the world. And that person left an indelible mark. It was kind of a love that was ruptured by politics. Somewhere in the novel, Firdaus says that we fell in love at a time that was unfair to us, that she could not... Anyway, I'll let you read the book for that. But these two young people try in their own way to try and reconnect their grandparents. And I don't want to give away what happens, but I want to stress on the need that younger people have to find closure in histories that don't necessarily belong to them, but they feel a resonance to. You know, I see it in a lot of young people because I write so much oral history about partition. I have seen the number of young people that are curious about the lands on the other side of the border, or wanting to show their grandparents where they are from, or take them, which is really quite an impossibility now. But there is palpable curiosity. In the same way, Samir Khan and Anouk come from a generation where talking about your feelings is common practice, which the original Samir and Firdaus don't think is necessary. They don't think harking back to the past is something that brings comfort. It becomes painful in some way for them. So it is very important to show the multiple ways in which each generation perceives the past, and in some way also wants to control the outcome of the past. You know, they do meet eventually. The young people do meet, and the conversations that they have about partition are very interesting, because they are conversations that young people today are having about partition. You know, unmaking the other in a way.
How true? Because whereas one generation wants to remain silent about the trauma of the partition, there is another generation, or the one after that, that actually wants to undo that silence.
Yeah, there's a really, it's actually one of the saddest scenes, I think, in the book, where Samir is an old man. He's in his 80s, and he's listening to this song by this composer, Drovzak, that he really likes, and he's dancing. And his granddaughter, Anouk, who is also a perfumer like him, they're both dancing. They're doing this sweet dance together, like granddaughter and grandfather. And all of a sudden, Samir just bursts out crying. And Anouk is very surprised. And she says, "What happened?" And he says, "You know, I'm thinking about what it may have felt like to do this with Firdaus. To be..." And he says it as if he's a young boy. To dance with a young woman, you know. And all of a sudden, Anouk, who really is basically the same age as I am, she feels for the first time that she doesn't understand this man who is her grandfather, because he's talking about this woman who is not a part of his life, but, you know, possesses so much of her grandfather's affection. And she says, "Well, I'll find her for you." And he says, "She's not your person to find. And actually, if you find her, and I see that she's had a really good life without me, I don't think I could bear that. So it's actually better, because in my imagination, we can be together. Whereas in reality, I know probably that that's not the case."
That's indeed very poignant, as to how in some ways it's better to keep that memory rather than test out its present reality. Yeah, it's a difficult choice, and quite often in probing the past, one brings more sorrow to one's own self than bring any consolation. You go in search of consolation and end up being more hurt. So that's the kind of sensitivity that your book has, Anchal. It would be wonderful if you could read out some passages, please.
Sure. Well, I'll read a bit. We haven't really talked that much about the war, but I want to read just a little bit about the war bits. Okay, so at the beginning of the book, Vivek, who is the older protagonist, he goes to war in 1914 and he writes letters home. And this is a short excerpt from just the beginning of the book. By late autumn of 1914, when the colors of fabric at their shop metamorphosed from light hues and pastels to the shades of earth and shadow, Vivek's letters also grew darker. He had fought his first battle, and suddenly, like the war, his tone became distant. His letters detailing the cold weather and the unending wait. Waiting was the only constant, for there passed days without any activity. He wrote about the waterlogged and marshy trenches they would crouch in during battle, the sound of bombs and fear of the enemy. He wrote of those who had died and many more who had been wounded and were recovering in hospitals. When winter arrived, the smell of guavas permeated the air of Vij Bhavan. Soft, leathery, creamy, sweet, eaten with black salt or sugar, they were Vivek's favorite fruit and became a reminder of his absence. His letters had become infrequent, and when he wrote in December 1914, he described how the entire battlefield had frozen under a thick bed of snow and the temperature had become unbearable. This morning, I found the ink in my ink pot to have frozen and had to melt the dark crystals over a fire so I may write this letter to you. All trace of green has vanished. Frost covers the earth as far as the eye can see. The clothes on our back are barely sufficient to protect us, and we have not seen the sun for months. Here, we are starved and sacrificed. In spring, the Indians had fought another major battle, and Vivek's letter described the dwindling number of soldiers, some succumbing to the cold and others to the inevitable consequence of war. Somnath, his father, read from the page, his voice hardly louder than a whisper, the words choking in his throat. Every moment we fear to be our last, and now it is difficult to say if I will return. These letters may be my last traces. It's become clear that many of us here will remain unremembered, unrecognized, unknown, for there is no one keeping record. Our contribution and our blood will quietly mix with the soil of this foreign land. So let me say this while I still can. We were here too. I read this because we actually haven't discussed the enormous contribution of the Indian soldiers in the First World War. Nearly 1.5 million soldiers went to fight first to the Western Front in France, Flanders, and Belgium, and then later they were sent to places like Mesopotamia and present-day Iran, and Iraq and other places as well. And I think it was, the First World War was the first time that Indian soldiers fought alongside European counterparts on European soil, so with white men, and after the war came back to India only to be colonized by those same white men. So not only is it a psychological complication, it is also a very unfair exercise in inequality, in really showing what inequality means. So here is Vivek, who wants to fight in the war, to feel equal, to see adventure. Now, a lot of these soldiers had never crossed any water body. They came from landlocked villages in Punjab, and they thought they were going on this grand adventure. They were going to Vilayat. They didn't even know what Vilayat was. And so they reached France and they received this incredible welcome in Marseille, where women are throwing flowers and the French people are welcoming the Indians because they will save them because they are large in number. That's why the Indian army was deployed so quickly. It was the largest battle-ready army. So the Indians reach France, and then they reach the battlefield, and they realize what this war is. They are wearing khaki. They have never seen snow. They don't know how cold it's going to get. They are forced to fight in something called trenches. There are no trenches where they have previously been. There were no trenches in the Boer War. There were no trenches in Afghanistan. This trench warfare where you are in marshy, waterlogged tunnels with rats and there's no hot food, and I suppose they experience Western culture also for the first time. So it's a huge cultural shock for them, but I think it is a huge learning for them. The Indian soldier learns about women's equality and education. It learns about advancement in science. And we know this because of the letters that they wrote home. The predominant source in writing the war chapters, and maybe the reason why they are so true to life, is because I used the archive of their letters. The Indian soldier was writing something like 15 to 20,000 letters per week when he first arrived in France. They were illiterate soldiers, but that doesn't mean they were non-literary. So they would read out or they would narrate to a scribe. And the scribe would write down, and they would then have to be censored by the British mail. So the reason we have these letters is because the British censor mail read them, said, okay, this can be sent, translated them for their officers to read, redacted some parts maybe, and then sent it across to the world wherever they were going. But it's a very complicated archive because it comes with such an enormous degree of separation, cultural separation from the real words that were being used. But I suppose it furnishes a really tender landscape of war, which makes it very human. The letters say things like, can you send me my shehnai? There's no music here. Or, thank you for the Quran that you sent me. And a soldier is writing to his mother, thank you for the Quran. People here still pray 5 times a day. There is no tea, there is no, stuff like that. Or, this war is like Karbala. I don't know how long it will go on for. Or what Vivek says, I don't know if I will survive this war. So, are you taking care of my parrot? Things like that. I feel like they write about such human things that we don't associate with warfare, that it was very important to put it in the book.
It's a fascinating archive that you had recourse to, and it brings me to my next query. Your earlier books have been non-fiction. It's been about material culture, particularly related to the partition, and you were also helping in the creation of the Partition Museum in Amritsar. So with handling all this material, such as letters, such as other artifacts of memory, what was your journey from being a historian of material memory to a fiction writer?
I think it's the intention of your project. Why are you writing something? Because nothing really in the methodology of my research or the manner in my writing really changed from my first 2 books to the 3rd book, regardless of the fact that those were history and this is fiction. But it is the intention with which you write the book and for whom. I was writing about partition because I was trying to let my generation be a part of something that no one really was interested in or didn't really see the connect. I was writing history for a generation that would need the records at some point to trace their own origin. Whereas fiction, you are trying to understand the elasticity of reality to be able to insert fictional characters and see how well they are absorbed into their landscape. So I think it is, for me, the genre of my writing depends on the intention of the project.
Well, that's very well put, is the intention of the project. So in one case it was history, and perhaps all the material that you had collected in your historical research helped create that other dimension. of saying, okay, I want to insert fictional characters into this historical archive and see what comes out of it. And I think it's very, very laudable that this is a book that reaches out to readers across the generation. It's not only written about 5 generations, but I think this is a book that appeals to those who have experienced partition or whose parents have experienced partition, and Delhi has so many such people and we hear about them, to the current generation of young people who are curious about the partition but don't really want to go deep into archival research, but have to absorb it within the cultural milieu in which they are placed today. So there is in some ways the recovery of memory, but there's also the recreation of memory which is comfortable for them. Because this generation cannot remember the partition in the same way as the grandparents' generation that experienced partition.
And I think even that first-hand experience would change over time. Memory is not a recording device.
Absolutely. It's not not a recording device, but memory is something which is very fragile. It keeps changing with context. So maybe on this note, it's time to open up to our wonderful audience here. The subjects that you have covered are of immense interest, and thank you very much. And I'll just open it up to questions from the floor. Yes, please. I think there's a mic that can go around that would help. Thank you.
I just want to know what triggered your interest in the very beginning in partition. Was it family circumstances? Was it stories your grandmother and grandfather told you? Close करिए. Did you get it?
सुनाई नहीं दे रहा था ना उधर थोड़ा क्लोज कर
It's okay. I understood the question. I actually, unfortunately, didn't hear any stories growing up, which is not rare. You know, the one thing with partition is it's difficult to generalize with everybody. So you will always have varying circumstances depending on who you ask and what you ask. I didn't hear any stories of partition growing up, and I think I was 23 years old, so exactly 1 decade ago, when I encountered these very mundane objects that my family had carried from Lahore to Amritsar, my mother's family. And I was never curious about partition. Even though we learnt about it in school, my instinct was never to come home and say, oh, did you live through this thing called partition? Because I think it was taught in a way that had so much distance from my present day circumstances that I didn't think it could impact or touch me. But when I heard my grandfather and his brother talking about these objects that their family had carried, and I suppose the viscerality with which the memory was still so fresh, and it wasn't the violence that they brought up, but the life that had been fractured before partition, I felt very small for not knowing anything. And the realization that if I didn't know anything, or certainly not enough, then the generation that would come after me in a world where history is being distorted and obfuscated and rewritten on an everyday basis, they would really lose everything. And my grandparents were still alive. Now was the time to start asking questions. And so the work really began as maybe something, a bit of a selfish endeavor to understand where I came from, you know.
Yes, please. There's another question.
Hi, my name is Gurinder Singh, and what you mentioned actually touches my heart. I didn't come quite prepared to listen to what you're telling me. It is so true that our parents wanted to, get over the pain and not talk about the partition. So there was a major gap in between the two generations, the one that suffered it, the one that lived it, and the current generation. So there's a huge gap in between, which you're doing a wonderful job in trying to bridge that.
Thank you.
But what I'd like to add to your point about the Flanders and what happened in Europe, my personal experience, I was in Belgium for an exhibition, and at that exhibition there was this beautiful, gentle lady, about 40s. She was following me wherever I went.
Because you're wearing a turban.
Because I thought it was because of my turban, and I was the only Sikh there because it was a very small little village where this very important exhibition on potatoes was happening. Okay. Well, that's a huge potato belt there. So the lady kept following me, and then, she realized I'm getting irritated. So I said, ma'am, can I help you? She says, you're a Sikh, aren't you? I said, yes. I said, ma'am, I'm an Indian. She says, you know what? I need to hug you. So I was not very sure what was the idea. She says, you know, you're my brother because your ancestors are buried in my grandmother's farm.
Yeah.
She says, even for many years,
Yeah.
when we used to till the land, there used to be bodies coming out of there.
Yes.
And she says, my grandmother stopped going to the farm since then. So then I give her a big hug and everything. So
And I think the sad thing is that not enough young Indians and young Pakistanis for that matter, because it was the Indian army at that point,
Yes.
realize the incredible contribution that we had. And I don't think it was until the centenary in 2014 that real research
Yes.
and a resurgence of interest in that subject has really begun.
that is right. So
I mean,
when-
we don't know what India Gate is for.
That is
If
right.
you ask anyone my age or younger, they don't really know.
So especially after the poppies, you know, the story that came up,
Yeah.
and then we began to realize what we have done to the war
Yeah.
effort.
And there was a khadi poppy also for the
That's right.
Indians. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you
ma'am.
so much
Thank
for your comment.
I like the phrase shadow of partition. I come from Jalandhar and I was born at about the same time as the your protagonist. The tragedy is that the story of partition has impacted maybe 5 or 10% of the Indian population. And it is really sad that the rest of India has not experienced this. And I wish that the schools, particularly children in the age group of 10 to 15, they know how much how much tension was there and how much sacrifice was there and how people have rebuilt their lives. And this is a story which will encourage so many people who are starting from scratch. I remember, the small shops which were set up on Queensway in 1947-48, and how those people built brick by brick, and how they are now prosperous people. So these are stories which we need to share with rest of the countrymen in India.
I
So
agree.
your efforts to set up this museum in Amritsar, I think such museums should be set up all over the country so that people are aware of it.
I agree, sir. Unfortunately, I only assisted Kishwar in setting it up. The museum is very much the brainchild of Kuldeep Nair and taken forth by Kishwar Desai, who was supposed to join us today but couldn't make it, unfortunately. But it's in Amritsar, and now they're actually opening a branch in Delhi at Kashmiri Gate in the Ambedkar University inside Dara Shikoh Library. Yeah, thank you.
So we have time for 2 more questions. One from Aman and one the gentleman there. Yeah. Can we have a mic here, please? Oh, okay. Please
Can
go
I
ahead.
with my question.
Yes, please go ahead, and then we'll take Aman.
Ma'am, I must compliment you for coming out with this wonderful book.
Thank you.
I have to compliment you for the amount of extensive research you have done on the conditions of the soldiers, Indian soldiers, especially in World War I, and the type of climate they had to face, especially coming from Punjab, most of them. Not really from Punjab, though it was all inclusive India, but mostly from Punjab.
Thank you.
And I must thank you also for bringing out the effects of partition. And I must compliment you for the extensive research you have done on this partition, whole partition matter. But I'm curious to know what made you select the title of this book, Everlasting Thing, when you have more of a love story in this.
There's a lot more.
So, what made you think about the everlasting thing? Rather, you could make it something about the love story, make it everlasting love or something like that. I'm just curious to know that.
In a way, the love is everlasting, as are many other things. I don't want to give it away, but there is a little story about the title of the book inside the book. So what I would say is, please buy the book to learn. Yeah.
It's
But
a
thank you.
charming title and very appropriate. And yes, you have to get to that chapter to know why it's called what it is. Please, Aman, go ahead. Yes, books are available for sale and the author will sign. May we have the mic here, please?
I came in a bit late, but I wanted to talk about India Gate because, it was almost as if you did the Twin Towers as Welcome to New York, because it's not a monument of pride, it's actually a monument of shame, because we welcome people with the Qutub Minar in Delhi and India Gate. These are not symbols that talk of our sovereignty. They don't talk about India as India should be talked about. So mine is the next talk, so I will address the issue. But I think that people should look at these monuments in the right light, and I'm very happy that they've done the memorial for the martyrs away from that, because this is really to have your grandfather's name written there and you get a little medal because you fought for empire is not fair to India at all, actually.
So, Aman, we look forward to your words in the next session. And meanwhile, Anchal, the floor is yours for a last statement.
Well, I mean, nothing more than I would be happy to sign books and answer more questions about the book if you have them after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anchal Malhotra, for that wonderful session, great book, and this participative audience and your perceptive questions. And the discussion will continue afterwards off the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Malashri ma'am, and thank you, Achal. I think we're all just equally emotional right now as we are enthralled by this amazing book read. And I think it makes us all go back a little and, kind of try and learn where we come from. Whether we were, products of partition or not, whether we did live through a partition, whether our families lived through partition or not. But I think reading this book will definitely want us all to go back and learn about our roots, if not anything else. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for being such a lovely audience. And we'll take leave from Ms. Malashri and Achal here. Thank you so much. And like we said, there are books available for buying and as well as for the author signing. Thank you. We'll request Shri Vivek Chandraji, member of the committee, to present mementos to both our panelists here.